Today's session, we're going to provide a basic overview of trauma and the ways that it shows up in our work and in our communities. And we're going to begin to unpack the approaches to trauma-informed care and share a few examples of its application. I'm going to provide a little bit of background about myself, as well as provide some foundational information and a few examples of how I integrated these As Ivy stated before, we'd like to invite you to share your thoughts and any questions you might have by using the chat box. I'll do my best to answer questions as we go along, as well as facilitate while Cynthia is presenting, so don't be shy. And you can advance the slide. Next slide. So this slide, it's entitled About Me, and it has some images of things that are important to my life. And I'm trying to embrace the radical vulnerability that was modeled so beautifully by my counterparts, Cleta and Carla. So if you've participated from the beginning, you'll know what I'm referring to. In the first image in the bottom middle is a cotton field from the Central Valley with the sunset over it. And I grew up in a small town in the Central Valley. I come from a family of migrant workers, and we grew up in a population of under 4,000 in a very rural, poor area of California. And it's a very strange microcosm where it's probably the only place in California people speak with a Southern accent. So it's kind of strange. Next to that, to the left, is a family portrait of myself with my 4 siblings. We're arranged from oldest to youngest. I'm the youngest of 5, and I was raised by a single mother in poverty. And we grew up in that town that was highly segregated well into the 1980s. We're mixed race. Our maternal bloodline comes from the Powhatan Confederacy, which is a group of tribes in the Virginia area. So I'm Patawomack, Pamunkey, and Mattaponi, and we're also Scottish. And we're part of the native diaspora of Indigenous families that were pushed west over the 500 years of colonization until we made it to California. We couldn't go any farther west than California. So I spent my summers running barefoot through cotton fields and riding horses. But unfortunately, my childhood was far from idyllic. I had a father who is also California native, who was very abusive alcoholic. So we had that to contend with. And in addition to that, 2 of my siblings are actually diagnosed schizophrenia, which made my family life very interesting, to say the least. But through that, I was always an artist. Even though there were no resources or exposure to the arts, I did anything I could to create, including pleading with the butcher to give me rolls of paper to draw on, or dumpster diving for boxes to make sculptures. So somehow I always found that in order to channel my energy into something positive and regenerative. And the next image, you're going to see a picture of a roundhouse, and that's in Yosemite Valley. And our roundhouse are partly subterranean structures that are covered in bark. And my teenage daughter is standing in front of it and surrounded by redwood trees. And next to that is an image of an elderly couple. So I was very fortunate that despite my upbringing, I was brought into and adopted in a traditional way with a beautiful family in Yosemite who were Paiute and Miwok. And that really gave me a more solid foundation and helped me find my spiritual home. Next to that is a photo of my infant daughter who is in her Paiute cradleboard. She's looking up at a beaded medallion that contains her umbilical cord. So in the summers, I worked the tomato fields and I saved my money so that I could move to the Bay Area to go to college. I was the first and only member of my family to graduate so far. And immediately after college, I gave birth to my daughter, whose paternal ancestry is of the Taku River Tlingit and the Cascadena from northern Canada. After college, I started a nonprofit called Sacred Circle Incorporated. And the next image, I think is there a problem with this slideshow? Looks like there's a message. This image is a group of 6 children ranged in ages from 18 months to 13 years old. And these were some of the children that came through my foster care facility. The mission was to provide culturally competent and stable environments for children of Native American descent. With my own experiences and that of caring for children in the foster care system, I learned a great deal about the trauma and trauma-informed care through that. The photo below that is actually of my husband and my daughter. We're in front of a city building in San Francisco with some portraits projected behind our image. And I'm also a survivor of domestic violence, and I feel really blessed to now be married to my best friend, who I actually grew up with in the same small town from the Central Valley. So we've known each other our entire lives. The final image really pertains to my work as a community activist and artist in my community engaged practice as a curator. This was part of a larger citywide American Indian initiative in San Francisco that was entitled The Continuous Thread, which I led in 2019. So after successfully having a racist statue removed, the initiative worked to continue the dialogue around the visibility or lack thereof of Native people and their contributions within the city. So I use my creative practice to challenge the inaccurate and outdated perceptions of Indigenous people and other marginalized groups. Throughout my slides, I've also included some of my visual artwork, mostly because Cynthia told me I had to, and because I'm trying to practice this idea of vulnerability, I included them. So although I'm a figurative oil painter, I see my work more as a storyteller, where I try to embed the history of the subject, either overtly or subversively, into the fabric of the work. I try to honor those stories that are often ignored and capture the beauty in those that are often denied by admiration or denied admiration by mainstream society. So we can go to the next slide. So here is an oil painting of the artist Frida Kahlo. She's looking off to the left with a pensive look on her face. She's clothed in a brightly patterned shawl with purple and red with long fringe. She's wearing a magenta colored dress with large beaded necklaces made out of turquoise and wood set against a bright blue background. The text reads, "To create a new story, we must first come to terms with the current. This begins by naming it." So I want us to first acknowledge that whenever we come into any shared space with others, we are also carrying with us our unresolved trauma. And we need to acknowledge this in order to transform not only ourselves, but our families and our communities. There has to be a lot of work done to destigmatize this concept of trauma. I've done a lot of work with communities that when I use that word, they tend to, some will shut down because they don't want to think there's anything wrong with them. But it is hard and messy work, and not everybody is ready for it. But I want to quote a curandera, Aurora Levins Morales, who in her book called Medicine Stories wrote something very poignant. She says, "Ours is a society that does not do grief well or easily. And what is required to face trauma is the ability to mourn fully and deeply all that it has been taken from us. But mourning is painful, and we resist giving way to it, to distract ourselves with put on toughness out of pride. What is so dreadful is that to transform the traumatic, we must re-enter it fully and allow the full weight of grief to pass through our hearts. It is not possible to digest atrocity without tasting it first, without assessing on our tongues the full bitterness of it." And I felt that really summed up what we're trying to talk about today. But I want to first ground us in our space today. If you can, I'd love you all to just to close your eyes for a moment and ground yourself, center yourself in the work that we're about to talk about, because it isn't easy work. But I also want you to start to call in an ancestor, call in somebody that gives you strength and power. We all have stories of our aunties who were formidable and strong, and our grandmothers who could make wonderful meals out of nothing, or uncles who overcame insurmountable odds. Close your eyes and think of that person, that the person of the stories that you've heard your whole life, because those are the folks that provide those stories that intertwine with the ones of loss and hurt, the weaving together which creates strong, unbreakable bonds. Picture that ancestor that symbolizes that strength, love, and survival to you. If you want, you can use the chat box to honor them. You could put their name in there, or you can just hold their image close to your heart as we move through these lessons about trauma and transformational healing. Because I want you all to know that we are more than just our stories of loss and suffering. We are also those stories of survival and love and resiliency. So I'm going to let you sit with that for just a moment. So Charlene says her godfather, her Uncle Bill, gives her strength. Thank you, Charlene. Carolyn says Callie Williamson, Mary Williams, and Loretta Ball. Some strong women. And Dijon says Annie Mae Hickman, her great-great-grandmother who died when they were 3. Aunt Ophelia, Aunt Ev, Nana Vera, your mom, Cleta, her mother. Thank you for sharing that. And by doing that, you're not only sitting and coming to terms with all of these things that have happened to you, but you're also honoring the spirits that guide you and support you every day. So we can go to the next slide. So here, the description of the slide is called Epigenetics and Ancestral Memory. And I've included an oil painting of a group of Hoopa, California Indian men who are in their traditional jump dance regalia. Many of my paintings are based upon old historical photos, and I try to capture the tension between traditional lifeways and the industrial age. This is the place where past meets future and sits in contradiction and defiance with one another. The sepia earth tones of this painting wash down and drip through the image like memories. In the process of painting, I am in some ways calling the ancestors back into the space out of obscurity, to be heard and seen, to be honored for their teachings and resilience, to value the beauty that is often ignored in our Western society. So this painting also includes text from published resources that acknowledge the state-sanctioned genocide against California Indians, where bounties were placed on the heads and white militias made their fortunes off of massacring villages here in the state. And this piece is part of the permanent collection of UC Berkeley's Multicultural Center. So with epigenetics, my elders, as well as those from many other tribal nations, speak about ancestral memories and the way in which our experiences and knowledge are carried within our blood and our bones and are passed down through our generations. My people believe that we actually hold these memories for 13 generations, whereas other tribes may say 7. For me personally, 13 generations back is right about the time the English landed in Jamestown and forever changed the way of life of my ancestral people. So for the Western world, science has just begun to study what indigenous people have already known, and they named it epigenetics. And if you're not a scientist like me and more of a visual thinker, a way to explain epigenetics is to think of the slinky as a DNA strand. And the job of DNA is to make proteins. So here it is flexible and pliable, and it allows the DNA to effortlessly do its job of making proteins. And this is the DNA strand of someone who has never experienced any trauma. It's very clean. Now, somebody who has a DNA strand that's marked by trauma, so these clips are all the epigenetic markers that happen when you experience trauma. So this includes those things you experienced in your present lifetime and those of previous generations. Here we see the mark of something like ongoing domestic violence, abuse, some of which is probably carried down through your family history because it is a learned trait. And these marks of trauma prevent the strand from flexing easily and functioning properly. And so scientists have done studies where they have looked at the epigenetic markers of men who have been abused. And within their sperm, they can see the epigenetic markers of that trauma. So we know that that is passed down from generation to generation. And we also know that the marks on our DNA strand also is linked to physical symptoms such as diseases, and including depression, PTSD, and autoimmune disorders like diabetes and arthritis, as well as cancer. So clearly those communities that face higher instances of trauma face higher rates of illness and disease. And I nerd out on this stuff all the time, and I can't help to think of the concept of nature versus nurture, which came up a lot as a foster parent. And what we can see is it's neither an either or, but a both. And so we are not only the product of our current environment, but we carry within ourselves an inheritance of experiences from our ancestors. But knowing that, and most importantly, knowing that we could also carry within us the experience of love and resilience and strength and the survival of our ancestors, it is possible to change those epigenetic markers. So we can heal our ancestral traumas and prevent the continuance of trauma from being passed down. But we have to do the hard work of healing ourselves, as well as heal those future generations. So we can go to the next slide. So here is a painting that was done, and it's based on my experience going to Standing Rock during the 2016 occupation. I'd organized a group of youth to go to support the movement, and we arrived the night of November 20th. And this is what we saw and experienced. You could hear the pops of rubber bullets and the grenades being shot. But what was overpowering was the singing of the bird singers from Southern California with their gourds. They were standing in the front line in prayer and dancing. And behind them were the military, or in the front of them were the military that stood behind barbed wire that was covered with icicles because it was so cold with the water canyons that they were using. The vehicle was spraying water in about 20-degree weather, spraying the water protectors with that. So a lot of people were suffering from hypothermia. My uncle, who was about 78 at the time, ran to the front line and he began to smudge everyone with sage, and he joined in the dancing. But the air was hazy and you could smell the gunpowder lingering. So that's the closest I'll ever be to experiencing war. And we know now that a lot of folks that were there suffer from the PTSD and residual effects of the trauma of that experience. So the text on this slide is entitled Types of Trauma, and it lists the generational, historical, complex, and vicarious. So trauma comes in several forms. Generational trauma is what is carried from one generation to the next, whereas historical trauma is more of a group experience, emotional and psychological wounding from massive group trauma that is experienced across generations. Complex trauma is exposure to prolonged or multiple traumas, and we could see that a lot in communities that are suffering high rates of violence and high rates of poverty. And vicarious trauma, which I also like to call lateral trauma, involves the prolonged exposure to other people's trauma. And this may lead to compassion, fatigue, or burnout. And as probably most of you on this call are educators, it's something to be concerned of. As empathetic educators, you need to be very conscious of that feeling of vicarious trauma. So next slide. So in this slide, it's titled Trauma Responses, and there are 5 different responses that they have deemed that you experience. It's either fight, flight, freeze, fawn, or friend. And it's accompanied by an image of an oil painting of a Maori woman from New Zealand around the turn of the 20th century. She's wearing a kakahu, which is a cloak, draped over one shoulder, and carries a patu or a paddle. She's also wearing a high tiki, which is the goddess of childbirth, made out of greenstone. And trauma shows up in different ways. Sometimes it looks like anger, or it may come in the form of panic, anxiety, and a quest for perfection. I'm reading the notes, sorry. Sometimes it forces us to shut down entirely and hide from the world. Or it may come in the form of people pleasing and the inability to stand up for ourselves. And sometimes it'll compel us to build those unhealthy relationships or connections to those that inflict pain upon us. And that's also called Stockholm Syndrome. Next slide. So here is a slide that lists the 13 characteristics of white supremacy culture and the associated traumas for each one. Some of you may be familiar with this resource from Showing Up for Racial Justice, and it breaks down white supremacy culture in the workplace. What I found interesting is how the cultural norms in white supremacy culture directly aligns and perpetuates or trigger trauma responses daily. So in this list of 13 characteristics, there's a related trauma response or responses to the right. For example, under perfectionism, white supremacy culture will normalize a punitive approach and prioritizes time. They prioritize time pointing out mistakes and flaws and making them personal, rather than putting the time and the energy and resources into reflecting to improve practice and value the learning that comes from mistakes. So for someone with trauma, this cultural norm can trigger unhealthy responses, where their unhealthy behaviors such as overworking, rigidity, hyperfocus is supported and keeps that individual stuck in a cycle of re-traumatization. So for white supremacy culture to succeed and remain dominant, it directly feeds off generations of trauma. Our trauma responses are reaffirmed and further embedded in the will that turns white supremacy culture. So Indigenous communities and others have adopted a framework called decolonization, knowing that it is in the interest of the colonizer to divide and conquer us, to separate us from community. Through this lens, healing becomes less of an I and more of a we. And Edgar Villanueva's book, Decolonizing Wealth, states it beautifully. He says that everyone has a responsibility in making things right. Everyone has a role in the process of healing, regardless of whether they caused or received more harm. All of our suffering is mutual, all our healing is mutual, and all of our thriving is mutual. So we're in this together. And next slide. So what is trauma informed? Here in this slide, there's another image of another painting of a Maori woman from the turn of the century. She's smiling slightly and her long dark curly hair flows loosely around her bare shoulders. She's wearing a traditional woven cloak, of flax draped over her shoulder, and a single feather is in her hair. So the text reads, realize with the widespread impact of trauma and understand potential paths for recovery, and to recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma, and respond by fully integrating knowledge about trauma into policies, procedures, and practices, while seeking to actively resist re-traumatization. And I'm sure we can name a few examples of how institutions and individuals, in an attempt to be relevant and woke, embraced movements such as Black Lives Matter, and in their arrogance and ignorance attempted to incorporate programming without the infrastructure, representation, and knowledge needed to do this in a way that doesn't adversely impact or re-traumatize communities of color. When we truly work through the values of trauma-informed care, the foundation for our ethics of care must be the active prevention of re-traumatization. I don't believe you can say you do trauma-informed work if this is not central to your efforts. And to be trauma informed, we need to prioritize the physical, emotional, and psychological safety of our communities and work to build a sense of control and empowerment. Next slide. So in this slide is titled From Theory to Practice. On the left-hand side is a box that has the 3 equity pillars of accessibility, power, and representation, which really drove my work at the San Francisco Arts Commission. On the right are a list of the trauma-informed norms, so to speak. So to be trauma-informed, you need to work to ensure safety, to develop trust by being clear, maintaining boundaries, being consistent, and keeping your word. You engage in collaboration by letting your constituents have a voice in what you're doing. They need to be a part of it. And provide choices so that folks have a sense of control. And also use encouragement. Come from a place of strength-based and recognize the strengths and skills of folks rather than the punitive or derogatory approach. So if you work through both an equity lens and a trauma-informed values, it can transform an organization. And I'll give some examples of that as we move forward of how I use both of these together. So next slide. So this is entitled Trauma-Informed Philanthropy. The image is a painting of a dark complected Ecuadorian woman who's peering slightly to the left over her shoulder. Her long dark hair is parted in the middle and braided with a ribbon of gold and burgundy. She looks to be deep in thought and is wearing a multi-strand gold beaded necklace, gold dangly earrings, and a white blouse embroidered with flowers of red and green. She sits against a bright blue background with flecks of gold. And it has a list of both internal and external approaches to using a trauma-informed approach to equity grant making. So for the past 20 years, I've worked intentionally to integrate these types of practices into my work. What I discovered is that if you're doing intentional equity work, you're also doing trauma-informed work. In many ways, they are one and the same. So about 6 years ago, when I began my work at the San Francisco Arts Commission, I worked to integrate these principles into the grant making. And it was a bit challenging at first, as many didn't either understand the cross-sector approach or the vernacular that was being used. So as I mentioned before, some are really turned off by the thought that they held trauma and that there was something wrong with them. So I replaced the word trauma with equity. And it's really important. It was really important for me that I addressed any internal issues before addressing external issues. And I know that usually gauging how your staff and your support team feels is usually a mirror or mimics what the community sees as well. So when I started internally, the department was a mess. There was a lot of mistrust. There were a lot of microaggressions that were taking place, lack of transparency. There was a reorganization that the team didn't feel they understood or were a part of the decision making, and so they were not in a good place. They were very unhappy. So I had to first work to build trust with my staff, and I spoke truth to power in leadership meetings. And I always joke that if I'm your token of diversity, you have a lot of work to do, because although I am a mixed race person who looks through that lens of color, I appear as I'm a white appearing person. So if that says something about your organization, if I'm your token person of color, you have a lot of work to do. So we had to do a lot of education on microaggressions and just basic understanding of what that meant. And so we pushed for internal trainings with Race Forward, both for our staff as well as our commissioners, who were the main decision makers. And we pushed for a dedicated staff position to address those issues around equity. And we were the first in the city to do that, or in the city government to do that. We also, through that, created a racial equity working plan and a racial equity statement that included a land acknowledgement. And and that model was soon adopted by many other city departments. So it helped that kind of trickle out effect that happens. I also work to create more of a circular framework rather than a hierarchical leadership structure in my department. And each team member were valued for their input. And we also instituted time for reflection, adjustment, and planning. And externally, we had to work to reimagine all of our systems in partnership with the community. And we had to engage them in any way that we could to get input, to build trust, increase transparency through our grant making processes. And we focused on accessibility so that language was more easily understood. We were clear with our criteria. And we use panelists to make our funding decisions, which is rather unique. So funding decisions aren't made by staff, they're made by a panel of peers. And I stressed an open door policy, so I could develop those deep relationships with my community members. And my kind of barometer of knowing that I was doing well was that by the second year, the people that were coming to me complaining were not people of color from the communities that we were supporting. They were people from large institutions that were predominantly white that weren't getting funded. So I felt that I knew I shifted by that kind of measurement, as well as we knew that our funding increased by 30% to communities of color. So before we were about 40 to 50%, right at the halfway mark, funding communities of color or LGBTQ communities, and it shifted to about 80% by the second year. So next slide, please. And one way, so this slide has an image of a young Peruvian girl. She's peering straight forward and leaning against a large boulder. She's resting her head against the rock, and her hair is framed by a braid. And on her head, she wears a crown of blue, pink, red, and green yarn. A blanket is draped over her body with stripes of red and green decorated with geometric stripes. So the text reads Gathering of Native Americans, or the acronym GONA, and there's a list of belonging, mastery, interdependence, and generosity. So it was really important for me to not only work toward equity and trauma-informed practices, but also explore ways that funders, especially government funders, could work to repair harm. And how can we provide resources to support those pathways to healing? And how do we do this knowing that our government and philanthropy are often the perpetrators of trauma and harm? So one way that we did this was to support the Native community by hosting a gathering of Native Americans, GONA, to help kind of mitigate some issues that were coming up in the community around trauma. And we had to slow down the process. We modified it from a multiple day gathering to a one-day gathering. And the 4 elements incorporate those 4 values of human growth that are found and responsibility that are found in Native cultures. So belonging is really about honoring children and understanding your place in community and honoring that, whereas mastery looks at reconciling grief and trauma within communities. Interdependence is how we work together in communities to make things happen. And generosity is the honoring of our elders and giving back to one another for their contributions. And there's a lot to this retreat, and we're going really fast through it. But it was very transformational and helped the group move forward. But one lesson is that these types of programs or interventions have to be ongoing. It can't be a one-off, one and done type of thing. It needs to be continually done because we're continually being re-traumatized, and these issues keep coming up. So next slide. So this slide is a quote from Tabitha Pamura, and it says, "Trauma not transformed is trauma transferred." And Dr. Gabor Mate, who's an expert in trauma, who is very influential to Cynthia and her work, he says that trauma is not terrible things that happen from the other side. That's traumatic. Trauma is the separation from the body and emotions. So the real question is, how did we get separated and how do we reconnect? Because that is our true nature, to be connected. And while working at the San Francisco Arts Commission, I had the great privilege of being introduced to and getting to know some incredible artists, some of who are doing the really hard heart work to support communities that are faced with extreme, challenging circumstances. One program that really stood out to me and really touched my heart was A Place of Her Own. So created by Cynthia Tom. I'm honored to share this space with her today. I know no other art program in the Bay Area that supports healing in such a transformational, intentional, and transparent way. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the mic over to Cynthia so she can share her journey and the evolution of her program. But I have to warn you, she'll make you feel all kinds of feels. You might need some Kleenex. So I'm Cynthia, welcome.
Thanks, Barbara. Getting people ready and needing Kleenex. That's great. Right now, so I'm a Cynthia Tom, but I would love you guys to just stop for a minute and take a really deep breath and just kind of metaphorically absorb what Barbara just gave you in a nutshell, like what the problem is and how our communities of color are underserved populations, why we're having such a hard time moving forward. Barbara just kind of summed it up in a nutshell. So everybody take a deep breath in. And if you don't mind for a moment, you could either close your eyes or do it with it open and just feel the roots, say from your hips down through your feet, going in with Mother Earth to really ground you right now with all this information. And what I feel I'm going to be giving you is some answers and some ways that I individually, intuitively have worked through some of these issues, and then how I'm working with women to do this. And we're using art, and we're trying to use humor, and we're using dreaming. So just take a deep breath in, maybe even shake your hands out a little bit. And then we'll start. So I am, next slide. I'm from San Francisco, and actually I'm in Miwok territory up in San Rafael, which is Northern California. And I always encourage, when we do events, we encourage people to say the names of the tribes and actually research them, because they're all still here. And also to help the general public realize that none of the Native folks were discovered. They were here first, they're still here. So I just wanted to honor that. So for me, I'm a Chinese US citizen. I've been from fourth generation, and I've been a professional artist for 30 years. I'm doing painting, found object, mixed media, and large installation and small, but large installation is where you can walk into whatever I've created, so it's immersive. And found objects I've been doing since I was born, and I'm gonna be 63 this year. I didn't realize it was because our family was poor in San Francisco. It was just fun for us because our neighbors left us broken bags of glass, plates, jewelry, and my mom always had us making things from that. And Barbara, you reminded me about dumpster diving. This is before they used to lock the dumpsters, but that was, we had maps of where to get the cool stuff around San Francisco. I started out as a street artist, actually selling formally in the streets of San Francisco. And now I do have a piece that was invited by the Smithsonian American Art Archives, which I'll show you. And I'm really proud of that. And I'm trying to practice announcing what I'm proud of. So for 15 years or more, I've been working in the community. I started to heal myself enough that I started to see how I could help the community as a curator and developing programs, and I'm working on healing, spirituality, and equity. And that's not to say these are paid positions. This is just driven by passion and intuition. And then the last part about me is that I suffered from over 30 years of depression, like pretty deep depression. I was on antidepressants for over 20 years, which I got off of starting 3 years ago. And it was a really difficult road because there's a thing called antidepressant withdrawal, which is biological. But I made it through with the help of my partner, Chris Matos, and a book called Legacy of the Heart, Spiritual Advantages of a Painful Childhood. It's a really short little book. And I have references to everything I'm talking about at the end. I got off, now I understand I'm on the other side of depression, and I understand that it was my teacher. I come from a family history of domestic violence and violence, and Asian silencing. And I've spent a lot of my life looking for acknowledgement and love in all the wrong places. Next slide.
Can you do
But
your visual
luckily,
description, Cynthia?
oh, thank you. Oh, sorry. Thank you. So I am, I don't know if this is visual, so Chinese American, but I have a medium complexion. I've got long black hair because of the pandemic. I'm not getting it cut. And it's very much turning gray, which I'm proud of. I'm wearing a fuchsia colored t-shirt and an amethyst, a little necklace, and one earring. And behind me are some of my paintings of either women doing surreal surroundings, or dress forms that are in surreal roundings. And I will be talking about those briefly. Thank you, Barbara, for that. So this slide says trauma as teacher. And synchronistically, Barbara and I are quoting Gabor Mate. We did not consult on this, but he is somebody I watch almost daily. He's all over YouTube, but he simply says, trauma is not what happens to you. It's what happens inside you as a result of what happened to you or your family. So because it's what happens inside you, you can actually change it. You can change your DNA, and that's what Barbara was talking about too when we're talking about epigenetics. And the reason I know this is true is because it's worked for me, and it's working for some of the women that I have gone through the A Place of Her Own program. So I know that intuitive art making can actually help us move from wounded to resilience. Next slide. So this slide has three images on it, and I wanted to just show you what I meant by found object art, because this concept is very much a part of the work that I do. And intuition is so important for us to regain and put importance back on. So the three images you see on the far right is the raw materials for the middle piece, that it's a Barbie torso and an upside down chandelier glass from one of those wagon wheel chandeliers. And then the picture in the middle is what it became after I did paper mache with it and painted it and put it into a wine crate, actually, that I upholstered with beautiful fabric. And the floor is a checkerboard floor, which I use a lot in my surreal work. And the image on the far left is actually a small brooch or a piece of jewelry you would wear on a coat. And it combines broken ceramic pieces, an old stamp that I found somewhere, and broken jewelry and an old coin. And that's learning. I learned how to pick things that I'm attracted to, and they just turn into art for me. And I'll talk about that later on. Next slide. So this is a painting of a woman crawling around on the ground, and the ground happens to be piles of rice. And the way I paint is the same way I make found object art. I just let images come to me. And I normally have between 10 and 20 art pieces going, all different sizes. Some are in little boxes and some are big paintings. And because if I get stuck on one, I don't feel like I'm stuck. I just haven't found the right thing yet. And the images just show up. And then even the titles show up. And I don't know if you can see this title because it's at the bottom, but the title is Research Series, Anthropologic Dig. And what I also discovered about my paintings is they're either my inner wisdom coming out, or it's like my higher consciousness or something predicting or telling me where I need to go. And this particular painting of the woman crawling on the rice told me that I needed to explore my ethnicity more, and I needed to look inward for a lot of clarification. So next slide. Because I had grown up in San Francisco at a time when it was very multicultural. I grew up in an area called Portola, Visitation Valley, and the Mission. And I actually learned Spanish. My parents never taught me Chinese because they didn't want us to have a Chinese accent. It was very discriminatory back in the 60s. But it's so when I started doing my artwork, I started paying attention to that painting that said to search within. And I started to wonder about things like, why did I keep dating violent men, violent or dominant men? It was a constant. And this is in my 30s. I'm asking this. And I didn't know because my parents never argued. They never fought. They didn't even disagree. They were probably a little bit too silent, but they seemed happy. And they were both always crafting and making things. And my mom and I kept talking about this. And that's when we stumbled on, I didn't know my grandmother was sold. She was, my grandfather was born privileged. His father was the groundskeeper for Leland Stanford before it became Stanford University. His first wife died, so my grandfather went to China to get a second wife to take care of his sons. And a second wife just means servant or slave. And he purchased her. And the only reason I know the history is because whenever Chinese came through Angel Island between 1910 and 1940, they were in turn interrogated on the island. And my grandmother got stuck there for 3 months. That's a whole nother story. But I was able to read the interpreter's interrogation papers, and she said she was given to my grandfather 2 days before they got married. So he bought her. And so she was wrenched away from her family, and he didn't even buy a passenger ticket for her. She came over in steerage, which was basically the cargo hold. Next slide. So then after I started doing artwork around her to just kind of release whatever that was, this was my awakening for me. Okay. And go ahead. There you go. So these images you're looking at now are vintage photos on pillows. And the two boys are actually my father at different ages. And the girl is my mom. And she ended up giving me essays to put on the wall with my art installations. And she said, that's the first time she ever told anybody, but my grandfather was an opium addict. And he traded her for his opium. She thinks maybe from ages 6 to 12, he would send her to go get his opium. And the dealer was clearly a pedophile. And the only reason it stopped is because my grandfather died when she was 12. And he had gambled all his money away. And when he died, his privileged family denied my grandmother because she was the second wife. So I started to create these pillows to kind of honor my mom's story. And then I found out my father was sold at the age of 1, which was very common in 1923. A Chinese couple from Oakland, Chinatown went to China and bought him, brought him back. And the story is that they were guilted into keeping him by a church in Oakland, Chinatown that still exists. But he got beat up so much that he ran away when he was 15. And all you could do is run to the other Chinatown, because back in the 30s, if you were Chinese, you didn't want to get caught outside of Chinatown too much. So these pillows, I can't even tell you why I started stitching them as pillows, but I knew it made me want to hold them and hug them and protect them. So then I thought, I wonder if other people would feel the same. So the next slide. So I created an art installation that has been traveling around called Discards and Variances. So discarded people in my family had created variances in our patterns and human trafficking from a Chinese family perspective, because I just wanted to speak from my experience. These pillows, I wanted to hang them so that they would hit people in the head if people walked into the gallery and they weren't paying attention. And so this beautiful gallery, Route 1 in Point Reyes, which is on the West Coast near the ocean of California, it's very near San Francisco. They invited me into this very white lead space. I think there's one Asian woman that lives out there that I met, but otherwise everybody's white. So they allowed me to write the stories on the wall, did whatever I want in the space they gave me. And the way I knew it was successful and they got excited was because so many people ended in tears when they walked through the gallery. And I felt like we moved the needle on compassion doing this. And then the other place that this has shown at is Rutgers University. And again, there's no funding for this, easy funding for something like this. So I would love to travel it more and have people have more dialogue. Next slide. So what that told me was people wanted to engage, and perhaps if they start to learn about their family patterns, because it helped me begin to realize that my self-doubt and my bad choices weren't mine. I learned from all these people. The fear I had, I learned from my family's upbringing and losing control of your entire life. Can you imagine? So this was a mural I did that was big enough for people to walk into at SOMART's Cultural Center in San Francisco. And I can't recommend them enough. They do this most amazing Dia de los Muertos in this giant warehouse, and they give artists space to really sing. And in this, I decided to make it a space where people can walk into, read a little bit about my family stories, but then ask questions like, what happened when your family left its root country? Or if you're native, what happened when your family lost all control over their living situation? And I had brochures and I had handouts, and I had to keep replacing them because people were taking the lesson plans. So what you're seeing here is a picture of an 8 by 10 foot by 12 foot mural. It's not even a mural, it's a space that you could walk into. And I have all those little pillows of my family hanging around. And there's a tree, basically a tree of life. And it says Hungry Ghosts Excavating Ancestral Patterns. And I dedicated it to Renee Yanez, who started the Dia de los Muertos for multicultural artists at SOMARTS. Next slide. So back to my paintings that are found objects and also tell me what to do. This particular painting, I started with a Vera Wang wedding dress. That was my inspiration. And then the background starts to fill itself in if I just allow it. I don't try to figure out the paintings ahead of time. I just go with where I think they should go. It's all visual, visceral. And I didn't know where this painting was going because it's this woman walking on a giant checkerboard floor there's a background of water behind it. And then there's these dress forms coming out of the back of her dress and off in the distance, like one she's left behind. And again, the titles are like found objects for me. Launching the Gifts told me what this painting was about. And it told me that I needed to become really secure in what I bring to community, what I bring to the table, so much so that I can leave those gifts behind with people who need it or communities that need it. So next slide. So just, this is big for me, that I realize that healing myself and helping community is the way I protest. It's the way I stand up. And I do it with my art. I do it every time I talk. And then I also ran Asian American Women Artists Association for quite a few years, pro bono. Part of it was I was a workaholic, and I think I was working because I needed to feel it. In order to belong, I thought I had to kill myself working hard and supporting everybody. And I got really sick. So this woke me up even more. So that's one thing, and I'll go into that a little further. But the reason I really cared about what was happening at AWA.net is because there's very little representation of women artists in this country, and let alone women of color. So we now there's a website that's slowly getting more and more attention, and we invite professors, curators, researchers, and students and artists, if they need to research anything on Asian American artists. The goal is to be able to find it on the internet. And I started this before the internet was the way it is now. But there's only like 2 books, I think, that are really dedicated to Asian American women in the arts, and only 1 book on the West Coast that is just for Asian American women. And then I was a founder of A Place of Her Own, which started as an artist in residency at the DeYoung Museum. That was a curatorial thing, and I'll go into that further as we go. But that's become my life's work at this point. So next slide. So there's those pesky paintings again telling me what to do. This painting is a woman in the forefront on the left-hand side, and the landscape goes way back into a horizon line with an orange and yellow sky, like a sunset. The ground is another checkerboard image, and the woman is rising off the ground with this very heavy checkerboard skirt that is the floor. And what this painting told me, the title was called Rise. It told me that healing is the foundation for equity, for social justice, because we can make programs accessible, we can have Bill of Rights, and we could have all kinds of opportunities for, and I'm working mainly with women of color, but if we don't feel that we have a right to stand up, or if we're too afraid to stand up because we have a family history of being our heads cut off, we don't know how to stand up, and we can't take advantage of all those opportunities. So this told me that we have to start with healing our women. Next slide. So I have hundreds of paintings, but I can't show them all to you. So this is my latest thing, and that's behind me too on the wall. And it's a triptych that's 9 feet wide, 4 feet high, and it's the beginning, I hope, of a series of paintings that are starting with the gathering of like hundreds of dress forms going way back into the space. And some of the dress forms are rising, and some of them have gold on them. But the idea is that I want to put the vibration out there that women need to come together and stop believing the patriarchy and the colonization that we have to compete with each other, because all we do is keep tearing each other down. We can't get anywhere. So I'm hoping when I paint these, I just want to put the vibration out there that women are each other's best allies. And I would venture to say not just women, but anybody that self-identifies as a woman, or anybody that has feminine energy. It doesn't matter what you identify as. So that's, and this is the piece that was invited to become part of the What is Feminist Art show at the Smithsonian Museum in the Archives of American Art. So this image and this story is there into perpetuity as part of this permanent collection. And I don't know if you guys know Judy Chicago, Carrie Mae Weems, but all feminist artists. This started in the 1970s. So I'm really happy we're the next generation to add to this. Next slide. So the other thing I'm doing is all the thought processes and all the questions I have for people about their family patterns, about all the philosophies. I realized that during the pandemic, I can't get people to come to my studio. I largely don't work with galleries pretty much at all, because I love that real personal connection with people. I started creating digital art on everyday products like tote bags, pillows, journals, because my idea is when someone orders something from me, I send a little meditation or a lesson plan along with it. So it becomes a mantra for you on a daily basis. So right now, what we're looking at top left is a pillow with a dress going sideways to the left that's made out of roses, and there's rose petals trailing behind it. And that's called Dancing to the Tune of Your Own Drummer. Below that is a book that has a cover on it that's about looking into your ancestry. And there's a woman standing in the middle with layers of digital images of pages of French old newsprint, Chinese newsprint, and wallpaper that I found, tissue paper that I've found. And on the far right is a tote bag that actually has images of like chrysanthemums. It's kind of abstract, gold and cream colors. And there's a dress that's a Chinese shaped dress on it that's like a robin's egg blue. So just going back to the pillow on the top right, the Dancing to the Tune of Your Own Drummer, say you were to order that, then I send you a PDF file that says, congratulations, you're unique. So celebrate all the ways that people don't understand you. Or if you're the one that asks the questions that upsets the family, or if you're the one that seems to ask the questions that no one else asks, or you want to live life different than other people, then this pillow just tells you, congratulations, welcome to the club. We're just like you. So next slide. So it's called Atelier Cynthia Tom, and I call it merch as meditation. So next slide. So besides trying to make the merch, and I'm still working on it, and the technology's kind of hanging me up a lot actually, but I'm working on it. I also, the workshops I design are also, and the projects I do, the talks, the public presentations, the art exhibitions are about inquiring within. So that begins to take the blame off of everybody else around you. You have to start taking responsibility for yourself internally. I am not a therapist. I did not go to art school. I actually got a business degree. And for what I do now, I teach what I need to keep healing. And then I share what's evolving intuitively for me and what has worked for me and has been starting to work for other women as well. Next slide. So for me, from the work I've been doing, I really think these are the top 3 areas, at least that I try to hit with the work I do. And one is we need to make it normal for us to be talking about the wounding from the colonization and the patriarchy. It's not a shaming, and don't live in isolation. Like, we need to make it okay to talk about this because you can't heal it. And as you know, and it's so synchronistic for Barbara and myself because we never really worked together and even talked that much until we started doing this together. And thank you, Barbara, I forgot to thank you for inviting me. But some of the words and our focus is so similar, like naming it. I mean, that's the big part of what I do for healing. And Barbara said that you have to name it. So number 2, we have to bring intuition back into importance because that's where your wisdom lies. And that's where your self-confidence and your power lies. Patriarchy and colonization taught us to make intuition a woo-woo thing and taught us to discount it completely. And that's why we've lost our power. And then the last thing is to grow your sense of belonging. Because if you can realize that you belong at the table and what you have to say is important because you're listening to your intuition, and that's what I love. If any of you have any ideas or have any questions while I'm talking, I forgot to say this, please write them down and talk to me about it. Nothing's too big or small. It's because I'm trusting your intuition. You're supposed to get something from me, or I'm supposed to hear something from you. And if you go quiet, it gets lost. So again, that growing the sense of belonging, if you start to feel that you belong at the table, there'll be less competition and other people in the room will be able to contribute to each other. So next slide. I hope it's okay. I get all worked up about this stuff. So I'm going to just briefly show you a little bit of what happens with A Place of Our Own. And it's evolving because of the pandemic and because we have more capacity. But this is a program that was able to start because of the work that Barbara did at the Arts Commission, because the participants that come in to work on these, to take advantage of these workshops, largely are not artists. And a lot of times arts funding only wants to fund artists that have resumes. Well, most of the people coming in don't. So, and then mental health sector, they want to know our mental health. Everything's in a box and we're not in the box. So anyway, A Place of Our Own is workshops, art exhibitions, and public events. And the basic premise is, if you had a place of your own, what would it be? And that's a really metaphoric, metaphysical question, and not as easy as you would think. On the left is a photo of an image I did. It's a painting called Location, Location, Location that I did many, many years ago. And it's a giant woman standing on like farmland with these little kind of Thai-inspired houses that are about as high as her ankle. And then this painting sat for a while, and somehow I just started to see these houses flying in the air. And there's 2 houses flying in the air tied to something out of the frame. And then there's one of the houses hit her on her head. So that became the logo for A Place of Her Own. And A Place of Her Own could be for men as well. It's self-identified women, but it could be for men. We just don't have the capacity at the moment. So go ahead, next slide.
And Cynthia, I'm just giving you a time check. You have about 15 minutes.
Oh God. Okay. So place, I don't want to go over this ad nauseum, and we could talk about it some other time, or you can call me sometime. But basically right now there's 4 phases, and it happens like building a house. So the beginning is naming your hungry ghosts or your heartaches. And then the second one is doing art projects to release those hungry ghosts. And then phase 3 and 4 is actually creating art from found objects that answers that question. If you had a place of your own, what would it be? And then presenting it publicly. Next slide. So one of the first things we do is we start asking you to write down the beliefs that hold you back. Like, I'm too fat, I'm too stupid, I didn't go to school, I didn't do this. And then we ask you to put it on rocks, 3 to 5 rocks. And then you have to carry it with you. Like, we meet weekly. So you have to carry it on your body for a week. And the photo on the left are rocks at somebody's work. She had to bring it to work. The photo in the middle is Isabel, who didn't realize she was going to have to carry them with her because she went to Yosemite that night after we did the project. So she had to carry it with her. And on the right are 5 rocks with the statements on them, the beliefs. And they have to come back and share it, and they have to share their adventures, and there is hilarity. So talking about trauma with hilarity, can you imagine? It's actually quite fun. Next slide. So this is the crux of everything I've been talking about, is looking at family patterns. And this is the exploring part. So we ask the attendees to create a map, a family map, and then you map in all the trauma. And what happens is you're able to see that your self-doubt and anything that you beat yourself up about is not just your parents' fault or their parents' fault, that there's just victims of the colonizers. And these were just coping mechanisms that are without question turning into terrible trauma. But this helps for forgiveness and compassion, which is the key for healing. Next slide. So this is a legend that Frances Cachapero did, because she had so many patterns. She had to make little symbols. And I just love that she let us share this. But instead of hiding, you can become curiouser and curiouser about your family. And it takes away that emotional sludge, because you can actually see in a pattern way what has been happening and why you have the trauma you have. Next slide. It's actually an explanation. And to support yourself on this journey, we teach chakra basics. And it's really basic. I'm not an expert at this. And the image on the left is a woman with each chakra. So it's red, orange, yellow. The 4th chakra is green, turquoise, and on up. And those are energy centers. Those are energy tied to certain organs or certain spots on your body. And we have people make flashcards. So what you're seeing on the right is a green flashcard with a woman holding tons of flowers. That's my 4th chakra and my wish for abundance and being able to accept it. And the card on the far right is actually the back of the 3rd chakra card of Reina, where we ask people to take notes of things that resonate with you, that you learn. So you can always refer back to your chakras. Next slide. So we're going to phase 2 now, releasing all those things and turning on your intuition, forgiveness, and self-love. Next slide. So what happens is you may not be able to maintain or retain all of this, but some of our alumni keep working on it even after the program's over. This is called intuitive collage, and this is what we start you with to turn on your intuition. The way I do collage, and I've been doing this for decades, is I don't allow you to make any decisions. You have to think so fast, it surprises you. But it is your intuition. You're responding to things viscerally. So next slide. So the other thing we do is start to get you to look at your little self. Where do you need to help her? And I love this picture because at some point you were a little kid with a cape on, and it's going back and finding that person again. Next slide. So one of the little workshops, which is really profound but sounds cute, is called Love Letters to Myself. And on the left is a collage done by Janet King. This was the second art piece she ever made in her life because her mom forbade her to make art. And she is native Lumbee to North Carolina. She worked for Native Health Service here, and Janet just passed unexpectedly 2 weeks ago, which was devastating for us, but we're happy for her soul. And on the right was the prototype. That is the love letter that I tried to write. It took me a long time because I could not come up with anything authentic. And it wasn't because my parents were mean. It's just they were silent. They didn't say much, and they had such trauma in their background. How could they? So if you can't figure out what to write for yourself, like on Janet on the left side, she actually wrote little imagined apologies from her mother. Like, sorry, Janet, I actually loved you, but I was a single parent and I had to work all the time. But on my side, I actually found this, if any of you guys know Jane the Virgin, I think it's on Netflix, the christening episode is fantastic. And she said, like, here's a couple of lines. May you always let your faith be greater than your fear. And whatever you dream, may you summon the strength and courage to follow through on it. I could not come up with that on my own. So first you make the collage, then you write kind phrases to yourself. And it may, like, we have one person that took her a year and a half, but now she sings praises from Aron Lee. And then the third thing is you add the phrase to your collage. Next slide. So then we move on from exploring and releasing to claiming. And this is where we take you to found object places. But it was different this time because of the pandemic. But there's this beautiful warehouse called Scrap in San Francisco. And we ask the women, because everything's so inexpensive, is just to go in and feel what you like and then buy it. Like, don't try to figure it out. You may not use it in your art piece, but it's learning to like what you like and then honoring that. So again, if you had a place your own, what would it be? And these are pictures of us working with, we have found object art instructors that are so good at helping put things together. Like, we know how to screw or hammer or glue anything or sew anything together. And on the far right, you see martini glasses and shot glasses stacked up. And it's just found objects that we found all over the place. Next slide. So going back to Janet, whose love letter you saw, one of the things that we teach, and again, this is to turn on your intuition big, is once you find out what your intention is for your place of your own, and you create your art statement, and we help you do it as much as you want or as little as you want. I always say that the found objects show up miraculously. And it was really scary saying that during the pandemic to someone who wasn't an artist, because I had no idea where she was going to find things. So what happened though was I invited her to come over. We social distanced because she didn't even know how to use a glue gun. But she found this box. Her goal was a native Lumbee cabin. She wanted to recreate that as a time machine. And native Lumbee cabins are log cabins. So once she knew that, let's see, I gotta calm down. She wanted it to represent a time machine where any of you could walk into and experience who you actually are if your family was never colonized or oppressed or patriarchy never came into play. And once she had that idea, she found this box at her doctor's office that we were able to just turn into a cabin shape. And then the weirdest thing is she lived in an iffy part of Oakland, California, not so safe. And she was walking across a huge expressway, International Boulevard, not normally something you walk across. And she stumbled on all these twigs. So I just kind of thank Spirit for helping me stick to my word that the found objects will follow you. And then I just showed her how to put it together, and it's the cabin that you see on the right, so that you could see the cardboard in the middle with some of the twigs on there, but on the far right, she completely covered it. And it really does look like a Lumbee cabin. Next slide. So this is a picture of Aran Lee in front of her art piece called Metamorphosis of Superpowers. And I'm showing Aran because she was a 2018 participant, and she kind of disappeared for a while, and then she ended up coming back. She was still working on her art piece. The Love Letters to Myself on the right-hand side is like an 11 by 14 board with red tissue paper, and there's hearts all over it. And it's her as a little girl, because on our Love Letters to Herself, I always ask you to bring pictures of yourself when you're little. And she has now become one of our facilitators and part of our leadership team. And when she first did the love letter, she resisted it heavily. She even wrote in the feedback that it has no proof in Western psychology that this will help do anything. And now she's the biggest proponent of it because it shifted her relationship with herself. So these might sound little projects, but they're huge. So next slide. So then the final thing I'm hoping is the exhibition or public presentation. Next slide. I just want to share two artists with you who have taken what we're doing and really made it tangible in their families and their communities. So the first one is Norma Carrera, and she'd been suffering. She left Veracruz 30 years ago with some very jealous relatives on her mother's side who just shamed her, guilted her, judged her for many decades. And she had no way of talking about it. And she went to place twice. This is 2 6-month programs, did the art show, and she realizes that all their anger has nothing to do with her. It's everything to do with them. So she was able to start to separate her beliefs in herself. And the wonderful thing is she was telling this story, and we encouraged her to do it in Spanish because that is her first language. And we would translate it for her, but she had her son do it. And it's the first time he heard this story of what his aunts and uncles and cousins were doing to her. And next slide. And it changed her relationship. We always invite families to come to these things if the artists feel comfortable, because it's not always the case. But in this case, her whole family, including her husband, had never heard this story. And the cool thing now is Norma is helping us along with PAS Spearhead, possibly taking some of what we're doing into their middle school that her children have gone to, and her daughter Helen is still in, because they've seen the change in Norma. And they want to know how to help their Latino and Filipino families. It's called Demerilac Academy, and they're in the Tenderloin, which is a very tough part of San Francisco. And I don't even know how we're going to do it, but I told them, you're asking us to change your culture, but why not? Got nothing to lose, because their families aren't thriving. And their measure of success is getting the kids to go to college, but the kids aren't failing after that, is what we've been told. So I'm so excited about where this might lead. Next slide. So I just want to tell you one more about PAS, and then I'm pretty much done. So PAS Zamora came to us, went through the program 3 times, and each time she shifted so much, and now she's part of our leadership, she's part of our faculty, and she's even got more things she wants to do in her community. She is actually coincidentally from the same area that Barbara is from. PAS came 7 generations living in the Central Valley of California. And when the US drew the Mexican lines, all of a sudden they became illegal immigrants and Mexicans, whatever, like the negative version of that. And so through place, she's been able to actually put the trauma out there: alcoholism, addiction, incarceration, homelessness, deep violence. And by speaking it and telling it through the art, it has opened up a lot for her and her family and even the community. So the 7 pictures you see it right in the middle are collages that she built on the 7 generations based on the 7 chakras. The first generation's at the bottom, the last generation, the youngest, is at the top. And the picture on the far right has Paz doing her artist talk. And her mom, I don't know if you guys can see her because of our Zoom pictures. Her mom is there. And then her great niece is on her left. And next slide. So what we've been doing is working together. I've been helping Paz design ways and projects she can do that are more simple for her family, and giving her supplies. And she's working with all the generations, and it's slow and it's messy. She wants people to know that it's messy. It's not easy, but it's a start. And we feel like there's big wings in there for place. And this is where women are proclaiming what they want for their lives. Next slide. Oh, thank you. So these are the ways that we work. We're trying to work with the community. So it's workshops, art exhibitions, public events. And then I try to keep the alumni engaged when we can, with platforms for like a Ron and Paz now leadership. So we're working to build the alumni. It's not over. When the workshop's over, we're just starting. We need funding for that. So next slide. So I do want to say, for any of you getting into this work, or some of you that are already there, you know this. When you're pioneering something, there are some big obstacles, and one is funding. I work so much for free, and no, I'm not independently wealthy at all. You got to be careful you don't overwork. And you got to continuously self-heal, because you are working with walking wounded. There's a lot of triggering going on. So you have to be very pure in your intentions. We always need help with outreach, and I put credibility, because I can say how great we are, and I could do all this talking, but I'm starting to ask the alumni to step forward and tell their experiences. And then we need people like Barbara, who put a stamp of approval on us, which is wonderful. The other thing is navigating white-lit spaces, which we just did very recently with some art shows. So I can speak to that, and that's a whole nother topic, but we learned a lot from doing that. It was very painful, actually, but I learned from it. Next slide. So again, just really quickly, we got to make being able to talk about this woundedness normal, and stop feeling shame and isolation around it. Again, recover intuition, and then grow that sense of belonging, that you belong at the table. Next slide. So this is a question I have for everybody on this call. Are you an ancestral family pattern shifter? So if you're the one that asks the family tough questions, if you're the one that sticks out like a sore thumb, if you seem to know things that other people don't seem to get, you're welcome to the club, welcome to the family. We belong together, so you don't have to feel alone. So it's something that I'd love for you to take in and really think about. Next slide. I think I'm done.
So Cynthia, do you want to stay on for a little bit? We're right at time, and I think we have
absolutely
some questions that
we have. As long as you guys would let me, I'm happy to stay on.
We have a question from Greta. She asks, how do you incorporate dreams into your healing work? Or did you mention that earlier?
When I say dreams, I'm talking about aspirational dreaming. It's like, well, yeah, we can work with men. Let's dream about that. I'm Dr. C.G. Jung, and I don't do dream interpretation or things like that. And I don't actually have a lot of dreams that I remember. So my dreaming is more about wishing. I don't know if that answered anything.
And let's see if there's any more coming through. We have a lot of comments. People really feel very honored for what you're sharing, and very touched by everything. So if you get a chance, you should read the chat box, because
love to.
As you do with me, you do with everyone else. You just really move them and give hope, I think. Let's see. Yeah, but I don't see any further questions. Are there any other questions, Ivy? Let's see.
I had to rush through it. It's so hard to know, what to leave out and what to put in.
Someone's trying to help you find a grant writer to find you money.
How do I stay
And
encouraged? It's spirit. I saw how do I stay encouraged? I'm really spiritual, and I don't mean religious. I just really trust that there is a higher consciousness, a higher power. And if you stay open to it, it will give you the energy where you need it. And if you're going in the wrong direction and you keep being stubborn, sometimes it'll hit you over the head, like with a back injury, which I've had. I used to be a volleyball player. I've had dizziness with my eyes lately, so that made me stay still and have to really focus inward.
And there's a common theme coming through. Everyone wants to know if you've used this program with young children.
And well, because of insurance and legal issues, I can't. But actually, PAS was invited by Southern Exposure here in San Francisco, and she worked with mission girls. So it's brown and black girls in the court systems, and they're kind of maybe 13 to 16 or 17. And we changed a little bit of the curriculum. She just chose a handful of the workshops. We couldn't do the whole program, but she got great response for it. And some of them decided they want to become artists and start thinking, working through life this way. So, so we have not little children though, but I'm open.
And it looks like Angelica down in LA, who wants to know if you'll partner with her at the Lincoln Heights Youth Arts Center, where she's the director for the City of LA's Department of Cultural Affairs.
Wow. This is mind-blowing. But yeah, I mean, we're wide open right now. I only do this program every other year because that's how the funding, they only let me apply every other year. Otherwise, none of us are getting paid, which is kind of nuts. But we just know this is really important work. So we're willing to move and grow. And like Demiralak wants to talk to us more, which is youth. But we talk about starting with staff and family first and volunteers, the adults. And then we train the trainers almost. Because if they're not in place, working with the kids isn't going to do anything. It's not going to change anything.
Yes, Ivy.
I just want to acknowledge and praise and give gratitude to Mark and Risa at Pro Bono ASL. We have kept them over time, so we need to thank them and release them. So thank you. It's been such an honor and joy to work with both of you, Mark and Risa, and everyone at Pro Bono ASL. And I look forward to hopefully getting to do more programming with you in the future. And you can leave as you desire, or you can stay on, but I know your time is up. And Cynthia and Barbara, I'm going to also wrap us up because this is a lot of work. And being vulnerable is also something that takes a lot of energy. And you were both so present and so vulnerable and so gracious and generous with us today. And I am so honored by everything that you've shared so openly, and also by the work and the example that you set in your communities and with your lives and with your livelihood. So thank you for all you do, which is also just words they feel incomplete. And for those of you who've stayed on later, if you would like to add your gratitude and thanks to Barbara and Cynthia, please do. And if you would like everyone to see your gratitude and thanks, make sure that you send it to panelists and attendees. It's pretty lovely to see that joy pour in the chat box. Barbara, Cynthia, this is the end of the Rootwork series. This is the end of tonight. But I think that so many juicy conversations and ideas and thoughts and questions have just been sparked. Would you be willing to share your email address with folks, or should they contact you through the Instagram handles that you shared?
It's on the last slide, a second to the last slide. I'm more than happy to share my websites and everything. I would prefer if we can do stuff on social media right now, because I am having this dizziness issue, eye strain, and checking emails sends me over the edge sometimes right now. But I love comments on Instagram, and you can contact me. And actually, I hate to say phone calls, but if you've got somewhere you want me to, just email me, and we'll probably have to end up with a phone call because of my eye strain right now.
And I can always help ping Cynthia too to get in touch with her.
Thank you,
I can
Barb.
help filter if necessary.
Thank you.